Welcome, everyone. Hi, I am David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, welcoming you to the latest of our webinars on after affirmative action. This one, collapsing the infrastructure of racial preferences. Now, here's how we're describing it. A Supreme Court decision against racial preferences in college admissions would go a long way toward restoring—
Welcome, everyone. Hi, I am David Randall,
Good heavens.
Director of Research at the National
Good
Association
Lord.
of Scholars.
I'm hearing myself on delay. Excuse me, everyone. That was a technologically freakish echo. Okay, sorry. What I was saying, long way toward restoring equality to American higher education, but it would be naive to assume that colleges and universities would completely stop using racial preferences if the court ruled the current admissions scheme unconstitutional. Instead, they may simply become more subtle in their efforts to manipulate the demographics of incoming classes. Is there a future where colleges and universities do not promote racially discriminatory practices in admissions? What might that look like, and how might we get there? And for all this, we have our three distinguished panelists. In alphabetical order, I believe this is Mr. Richard Kallenberg, Senior Fellow at the Progressive Policy Institute, and also non-resident scholar at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, professional lecturer at George Washington University's Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. Many distinguished things in the CV. Author or editor of 17 books, including The Remedy, Class, Race, and Affirmative Action. Next, Professor Randall Kennedy, who is Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School and served as a law clerk for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. Also the author of an extraordinary number of books. I will just say the first one on the list, For Discrimination, Race, Affirmative Action, and the Law. And finally, Professor Maimon Schwarzschild, who is Professor of Law at the University of San Diego, served in the US Department of Justice, accredited journals at the United Nations, also author or editor of numerous books, including with Gail Harriet, A Dubious Expediency, How Race Preferences Damage Higher Education. Now, these books ought to be listed, many of them, in either the chat or the Q&A button below, so we can encourage everyone to go to Amazon and purchase. Support for the retirement, our three panelists. Now, chat and Q&A buttons. This is important because the structure is going to be 12 to 14 minutes, reasonably conversational presentations by our speakers, then followed by a Q&A, which is ideally powered by you, the audience. You will put in your questions into chat and or Q&A, I guess by preference chat, just to keep everybody in the same place if possible. I will convey these questions and or the panelists will read them themselves. And the panelists are also free just to talk to one another, be conversational, and make this be a good back and forth. I will mention, this is being recorded for posterity. If you have to leave suddenly, it's going to be on the NAS YouTube channel, not just live, but in perpetuity. And also, if you have questions which don't get answered during the presentation, send them afterwards to me, randall@nas.org, and I'll be delighted to forward them to our panelists so they may have the option to respond to you. So don't worry, all questions ought to be answered. Having said all that, Mr. Kallenberg, may I ask if you'd be so kind as to speak first?
Great, thank you so much, David. So I have some slides, and so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if this works. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate the introduction, David. Just one footnote, I am affiliated with the Progressive Policy Institute, but they actually have a very different position on affirmative action, so I should clarify that. This is quickly becoming a very important question. What comes next? Because most people are assuming that the US Supreme Court is going to strike down the use of race in admissions. Okay. So I have long advocated a third way on the issue of affirmative action, preferences based on class rather than race. And I've always had two rationales. The first is as a matter of fairness, that it makes sense to, if we're trying to identify students who are truly meritorious, to look at their academic record, their leadership, all the qualities that we would want to look at in the context of what obstacles they have overcome. And so as a matter of fairness, poor and working class white and Asian students have overcome hurdles and deserve a leg up in college admissions. And poor and working class Black and Hispanic students deserve a leg up in admissions. And in practice, they tend not to under the current race-based system of affirmative action. So I was involved in the litigation against Harvard and UNC, and the data showed that 71% of the underrepresented minorities, that is Black, Hispanic, and Native American students, came from the top socioeconomic quintile, the richest fifth of those particular racial groups. So Harvard is majority minority, which I think is a beautiful thing. It also has 15 times as many wealthy students as low-income students. And so irrespective of the racial impact, I just think it makes sense as a matter of fairness to provide a leg up in admissions. But I do have a second interest, and that is in addressing the long and shameful history of racial oppression in this country. I do not think we can just leave that and assume that we're being fair. And so to me, it's quite important that the victims of racial discrimination, particularly Black, Hispanic, and Native American students, will disproportionately benefit from class-based affirmative action because discrimination and race shape opportunity in America, and therefore these groups are disproportionately poor. That's not my only purpose, but it is one of the purposes. So this is where the American public is. This is a poll from the Washington Post in October of 2022, which found that 64% of Americans are in favor of efforts to increase diversity on college campuses. They think that's a good thing. And at the same time, 63% of Americans do not want race used in admissions. Now, some of my liberal friends say, well, this is, people are trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to get racial diversity without racial preferences. That's impossible. I think it's quite possible. And in the expert litigation, or in the litigation, I worked with one of the other experts, Peter Arcidiacono, a Duke professor, to simulate what would happen at Harvard and the University of North Carolina if you moved away from a system of race-based affirmative action to one based on class. And this is the simulation from Harvard. And you'll see that if you provide a leg up to economically disadvantaged students of all races, get rid of some of the unfair preferences for wealthy students, like legacy preferences for the children of faculty and the like, then you see some shift in admissions. So white admits decline from about 40% to 33%. Asian American admissions go up. Black admissions go down slightly. I can talk a little bit more about that later. Hispanic admissions go up. The proportion of students who were socioeconomically disadvantaged would be quite different. You would go from a population that is now about 82% advantaged, coming from basically the top third of the American population socioeconomically, and that would decline to 51% from the top third. You could do all this and have very high academic standards. So Harvard complained that the SATs were going to decline 1 percentile from the 99th to 98th. My response was that if you're looking at a student population that's overcome many more disadvantages than the current population. The fact that they're at the 98th percentile suggests they have a lot of really a lot of things to offer. Okay. So we're already getting reactions to this middle ground, affirmative action based on class rather than race. And we're seeing extremes on both ends. So just this past week, Richard Rothstein, writing in the Atlantic, said that universities should simply defy the US Supreme Court. His position was class-based affirmative action is not going to produce enough racial diversity in his view. And therefore, there should just be an effort to disregard the Supreme Court. On the same day, on the far right, Brian Fitzpatrick, writing the Wall Street Journal, said that race neutral alternatives, the idea that the vast majority of Americans support, is just a discrimination for racial discrimination by proxy. And if even part of the motivation is to cause racial effects, then those race neutral alternatives are illegal. Now, this is a National Association of Scholars meeting, and so I'm going to focus more on responding to the second one than the first one, more to Fitzpatrick than to Rothstein. So first of all, I think it's relevant to point out that conservatives have long supported race-neutral alternative strategies. So when Texas stopped using race in the 1990s, Governor George W. Bush created the top 10% plan along with the state legislature, precisely because it was a way of achieving racial diversity without racial preferences. Conservatives said that they had no problem at that point with using the top 10% plan. They challenged the use of race, but not the use of geography as a way of achieving racial diversity. And in fact, Justice Thomas talked about the top 10% plan in the Fisher 1 case in 2013 as a plan which allowed you to admit students without discrimination. Justice Samuel Alito in the second Fisher case talked about the ways in which the top 10% plan and other race-blind holistic review would achieve diversity without interjecting race into the process. So these are the plans that they favor. So I think conceptually we can think of, this question is falling into three categories. So for decades, the law has been under Bakke, Grutter, and Fisher II that racial diversity is a compelling interest and therefore that race can be used if narrowly tailored. The middle ground position, which is where the American public is and where Justice Thomas and Justice Alito have been, at least in the past, said that race was a permissible goal. Racial diversity was a permissible goal. And so the answer is no to racial preferences, but yes to race neutral alternatives. And now on the extreme right, you have groups like the Pacific Legal Foundation saying that racial diversity as an ends is itself impermissible. And so no to racial preferences and no to race neutral alternatives that are aimed, at least in part, for racial diversity. Now I want to close with a description of how things would change in the, using Harvard as an example, in the admissions process if we shifted from race to class. Because earlier I said that the racial results wouldn't be all that different, which is true. But the way you get there is so different, and I think that should matter in the process. So this is, again, from the litigation, an indication of the size of the preferences that Harvard uses. Harvard will say that it counts a million different things in admissions, but some things count a lot more than others. And this is from Professor Arcidiacono, and these are the Logit estimates. So in essence, the bigger the number, the bigger the preference. Recruited athletes got the biggest preference. African Americans, the second biggest preference. Legacy applicants, the third biggest preference. Then you had the faculty and staff dependents. then Hispanics. Then there is a preference in admissions if you apply early rather than during the regular process. And then way down towards the end, Harvard got around to providing a marginal benefit for disadvantaged students and first-generation students. And of course, famously, there was a penalty, a negative coefficient if you were Asian American. So if Harvard were to use the class-based system, it would completely upend these numbers. In the simulations, we did not change the preference for recruited athletes, but you could change it, particularly for boutique sports that came up during the oral arguments in the Supreme Court, like fencing. You wouldn't get rid of fencing as a sport, but you could get rid of the preference for fencing. Obviously, the African-American percent logit estimate goes to 0 under the simulation. So the second biggest preference is completely eliminated. Legacy eliminated. Faculty and staff dependent eliminated. Hispanic admissions preferences eliminated. Early action, we had different ways to handle that, but in some of the simulations, you would get rid of early action preferences. And then you would boost the preference for disadvantaged students. So my point here is that in the process is dramatically different, even if the results are comparable in terms of the racial composition. And I think that ought to matter in judging the admissions process. And to my mind, my friends on the left have been far too focused singly on the issue of the racial result as opposed to the class diversity, the fairness of the process, and other things. I think that the conservatives will be making the same mistake if they do the same thing. So this is the final point, the dangers of overreach. There is, some question about whether judges should be consistent, and this would clearly be a judicial bait and switch if the conservative justices who had been for years advocating race-neutral alternatives turned around and said that they were illegal themselves. Consistency is something that is desired but doesn't always happen. So I guess I would suggest to this audience, perhaps more importantly, is the issue of politics. So there was that liberal overreach for 55 years, defending a policy that had very, very little public support. But conservatives are in danger of, if you all oppose race-neutral alternatives, of making the same mistake in the other direction, that would be a mistake. It will look more punitive and as opposed to principled in switching positions. And the last thing is if the Republican Party is serious about trying to be the party of working class Americans, I think it would be a huge mistake for them to say that just at the moment when working class white and Asian students become eligible for this new form of affirmative action, that's the time to pull the rug on the whole enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure hearing your first of our three. And now we're going to have the equal pleasure of going to our second of three. Professor Kennedy, would you be so kind?
Thank you very much for having me on. And it's a great pleasure to interact with my colleagues on this panel. Just a couple of comments following on from Richard Kallenberg. I admire Richard Kallenberg and his ideas. And frankly, if his ideas had sway, I'd probably be willing to, it'd be fine with me. He could count me as being on board. But there are a couple of problems. One One is that he's, as he indicated in his own remarks, he's going to confront critics from his left and his right. Let me start with the right, since that's what he really focused on the most. He made it seem as though people like Brian Fitzpatrick were, he said that they're, way on the right, extreme on the right. I'm going to actually embrace for a moment, at least for the sake of argument, the Fitzpatrick position. And when we go on further, I'm going to invite Richard Kallenberg to respond, because I could imagine that Brian Fitzpatrick and people who see things the way that he does might very well say, listen, we have a principled commitment, not, we haven't shopped this around to focus groups. We haven't taken polls. We have a principled commitment to a vision of society in which race ought not matter at all. So if you take that position, you ought to be willing to say, frankly, for us, we don't care if the entire student body of Harvard University is white. We don't care if the entire student body of Harvard University is black. We don't care if it is entirely Asian American or what have you, because in our view, we don't want race to matter. And that's a principled view. That's how we want, we think that society, American society would be better if people had that idea. They might very well say, listen, nobody complains, or at least very few people complain when you have you see basketball games. We're in the basketball playoffs. Oftentimes these games will have all black teams. People don't say, well, the Boston Celtics don't look like Boston. No, they look like the best players, and that's what we want. So, it seems to me that you're really going to have to grapple more, Mr. Kallenberg, with the people who say we have a principled position in which we don't care about really the racial demographics of the school. Now, second, that's not my position, but it seems to me it is a position that is out there. And it seems to me it's going to be a position that you're going to have to grapple with. I don't like that position. That's not my position. It's a position that has long been with us in American society. It's a position that has a long historical lineage. People ought to remember that the first federal civil rights law was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 said that all persons born in the United States would have the same rights as whites to enter into contracts, to sue and be sued, to own property, to be witnesses. Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, saying that it would give discriminating protection to the Negro. Andrew Johnson was against the 14th Amendment for the same reason. And you read his veto messages. They have a disturbing modern sound to them, because his basic position was, well, these efforts to help out black people constitute discriminations against white people. They are a type of illicit favoritism for the Negro. This idea has been around with us for a long time. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who holds this idea is racist. No, I think that there are perfectly principled people who are non-racist who hold that idea. I am saying, however, that there are a lot of white people who have been racist who have held that idea too. And they view actually any effort to advance colored people as illicit. And again, Professor Kallenberg, you're going to have to face that, because you're going to have to face people who are going to say, listen, you say that you're for race neutral, class based affirmative action, zip code affirmative action, income affirmative action, wealth-based affirmative action. There are going to be millions of people who are going to say, that's just window dressing. That's just affirmative action that's racial affirmative action through a different means. That's just a clever workaround. To the extent that you say that you want racial diversity, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, there we go. That's the hint that we needed. That is affirmative action. And it seems to me that you're going to have to confront that. Last, let me just say what I think is going to happen. I think that frankly, it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court comes up with. Maybe we'll know in 48 hours. I suspect that the Supreme Court is going to tighten up affirmative action, racial affirmative action. Do I think that the Supreme Court ruling is going to get rid of racial affirmative action in higher education? No, I do not. I think that there will be some rhetoric, some parts of the opinion that get rid of, or at least try to get rid of, the most explicit references to race. But I don't think that the Supreme Court is going to be willing to do what it would require to truly uproot the diversity tradition that has arisen. I think that the diversity tradition, the diversity impulse, the diversity ethos has really sank very deep roots in American society, including in some conservative circles. I'll end by saying, let's take a look at this very discussion right here. Let's take a look at this, what we have here right on our computers. I'm very happy to be with my colleagues. I wonder, with respect to the people who put this together, I wonder if at some point, whether explicitly or implicitly, they wondered, they concerned themselves with the racial demographics of the panel that would be speaking. I'm Black. Is it accidental that I'm on this panel? I've been on many panels that were sponsored by conservative organizations. I often had the feeling that these conservative organizations, they wanted to have a certain, diversity of various sorts. They wanted also to have some racial diversity. I got the sense, it might be pertinent here, it might be true here. I got the sense that there were people who were sponsoring events like this who thought that, won't look good, bad optics, it'll be, delegitimating for us to have a panel of 3 or a panel of 4 with no people of color on the panel. Well, if that's the view, and I think that that is among a lot of people, if that's the view, that, it seems to me, is a signal of the way in which the diversity ethos has really, sank, quite deep roots. And I think that those roots have touched the Supreme Court of the United States itself. You've seen this, a number of the conservative justices have talked about how they make special efforts to reach out and welcome law students of color. Well, if they're making special efforts to reach out and welcome as potential law clerks, law students of color, diversity, bingo. affirmative action. And, you know, a number of the conservative justices have said that they do that. And again, it seems to me that that is, again, a hint of the way in which the diversity ethos has sunk deep roots. I'll subside. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will mention I did not actually take part in the choosing you, but actually, no, I don't actually think there was any attempt of that sort. We have had plenty of panels in this webinar. Oh, without any thoughts to this, I think we just happened to think you were an interesting person and an interesting voice. Anyway, we'll now go on to Professor Schwarzschild.
Thank you, David. I trust you can hear me and I'm not muted. The topic that we've been given today is after affirmative action, but I think Randall Kennedy is right, that it's by no means certain that we will soon be after racial and other identity group preferences. The Supreme Court has repeatedly come close to holding that equal protection, non-discrimination on the basis of race, means non-discrimination on the basis of race. But given the establishment embrace of race preferences, and race preferences are very much more than what Mr. Kallenberg calls a leg up, very much more and very different to what Randall Kennedy calls a special effort to reach out and welcome people of color or any group that you're seeking to welcome. It's very different to that and very much more than that. The Harvard case gave extensive evidence of just how enormous the discrimination and the preferences are, discrimination against Asian American applicants at Harvard, discrimination in favor of certain favored identity groups. This is not just a leg up or anything like it. And yet the establishment in this country, Harvard is a paradigm of it, has embraced racial preferences. And the Supreme Court, in case after case, often by a single vote in 5-4 decisions, has so far failed to take the view that this is racial discrimination and it violates the Constitution. When government does it, when public institutions do it or publicly funded institutions do it, that it's illegal. And this goes back to the fragmented Supreme Court decision in the Bakke case in 1978, or even further to the DeFunis case just shy of 50 years ago now. What is clear is how corrosive racialist preferences, the racialist preference regime has been for higher ed, increasingly for lower ed, and more for big corporations, or many or most bureaucratic organizations of all kinds in this country. It has meant in the academic context, academic standards constantly and consistently pushed downwards. It has meant a culture of lies. Randall Kennedy talks about an ethos, and in some ways, he has been looking at it, and in some ways, in fact, it has been a creditable and a benign ethos, but in other ways, and increasingly, an ethos of lies, of propaganda, of indoctrination, that in a sense is almost inevitable and necessary in order to cover and hide and provide a spurious justification for unpopular and unjustifiable programs. Perhaps worst of all is the mismatch of minority students who would have done well or no worse than average at schools that they were actually qualified for, pushed by out of control diversity policies into schools where they're likely to come out at the bottom, sometimes not to graduate at all, and more often not to stay in challenging majors and courses, science, engineering, pre-med, the STEM areas, in which affirmative actionly favored admittees in very troubling and very large numbers come in with the ambition to do these things and then drop out because they are mismatched to the institution that they have been artificially pushed into. The preference regime is far from diminishing as the decades away from Jim Crow recede into the past. On the contrary, the preference regime is growing more and more pervasive, more and more obsessive, more and more a priority at colleges and universities and other institutions as well, pushing out other priorities, a kind of faith and a bureaucratic fervor. So if the Supreme Court does do what many of us, on all the evidence, a majority of Americans, think is the right thing to do, and hold racial and ethnic preferences and discrimination illegal, the question is, what will happen? And it's almost certain, it seems to me, that the bureaucratic, preference-minded bureaucracies will go into overdrive to try to get around the Supreme Court decision. The leading workaround is likely to be class preferences, class affirmative action. And in a lot of ways, there's something attractive about that. Mr. Kallenberg puts a good case for it, and a good faith case for it. On the whole, good faith. I mean, he calls his opponents extremists in a way that I remember back in. And I'm ancient enough to remember the Nixon administration, and President Nixon had a rhetorical trope all the time. You know, on one extreme there's this view, and on the other extreme, on one extreme there's let's have nuclear war, and on the other extreme let's surrender to the Soviets. But I'm in the middle, and it's a rhetorical trope. But the idea of class, of doing things by class, preferences by class, discrimination by class, rather than by race, does have some attractiveness to us. For one thing, it's not racialist. And after all, the US Constitution really does, broadly speaking, prohibit or try to prohibit race discrimination. It's also true that class background isn't visible at a glance and throughout your life. So that people getting class preferences might not be under a lifelong cloud, as you may be with race preferences. And it's true enough that public state universities were founded in part to make higher education broadly available. But there are serious drawbacks to class affirmative action, class preferences. First, as with all preferences, they discriminate for some people and inevitably and necessarily against others, and not impartially, not with an eye to the merits, judging the merits as best we can, not perfectly, nothing can be done perfectly, but judging the merits as best as we can. Such preferences don't do that impartially, but instead they prefer and create favoritism on the basis of accidents of birth or in the case of class, of upbringing as well. Second, and most crucially perhaps, there's the crucial question about who is to get class preference. Class is much harder to define than race. We pretty much know who's white and who's black. There's some dubious cases around the edges, perhaps more and more as time goes on, especially perhaps about who's Hispanic, but still it's pretty clear. As for class, well, everybody pretty much agrees that this is not just a matter of money, certainly not just a matter of what your family income is. For one thing, it's pretty easy to hide how much money a family really has. So what are the criteria? Parents' education, parents' occupation, the neighborhood or neighborhoods that you grew up in, the net wealth of your family, the quality of your primary and or secondary school, your family structure. Were your parents, when were your parents married? Were they married at all? Was there a divorce? Is there a single parent? How old were your parents when you were born? It's not at all clear how you rank order some of these. How do you rank order the quality of primary schools, the status of parental jobs, the neighborhoods? There are lots of ad hoc judgments to be made. And what it means is enormous discretion over the criteria, and especially over the weighting of the criteria once you choose which criteria it will be. And this makes all the difference. So that if you have 3 or 4 criteria and you weight some of them more heavily than others, invariably you're going to have to choose how much you weight each of them. Depending on how you do that, it will affect overwhelmingly whom you give favoritism to. And by the way, institutions that do this never disclose they tend not to disclose exactly what the criteria are, and they never disclose what the weightings amongst those criteria are. So that there is enormous discretion there. And that discretion is a virtual open invitation to gerrymander for racial or ideological or other favoritisms in terms of whom, on a college context, whom you're going to admit, whom you're going to hire into faculty posts, whom you're going to promote, and so on. So the idea that class affirmative action will have to be administered in this way, with a variety of fairly disconnected criteria, given that there's no clear answer, there's no clear definition of class. All of that discretion is an open invitation, if not to non-race neutrality, certainly not to neutrality in other ways, because the temptation to use this in order to bring in people of a particular political ideology, of a particular background that has lobbying support in the state legislature and whatever. It's an open invitation to that kind of abuse. Even if class preferences are really administered as class preferences and not just as a gauzy disguise for race preferences, the consequences are likely to be anything but benign. For the past 50 years, race preferences were justified as measures to integrate Americans and to bring people together. In fact, they have advanced race consciousness, anger, grievance, a whole ideology to justify the preferences. And they've advanced racial separatism, separate dorms on campus, separate graduations, separate academic departments and courses, in effect, separate dining, and much more. The whole critical race theory, DEI ideology developed to justify race preferences. Race preferences have also systematically mismatched students into schools where they're liable to fail or do poorly compared to their classmates. These same things are apt to happen in the case of class preferences which will be far more than a leg up. It's natural that if a group is getting preferences, especially high preferences, heavy preferences, to develop a theory of why this is justified or necessary. Class preferences are almost bound, therefore, to promote class consciousness and a growing sense of class grievance, a whole ideology of class identity. This is something the political left, far left, here I'm echoing Mr. Kallenberg, so we're both guilty of this. This is something the political far left has long dreamed of for America, ever since Werner Sombart in the early 20th century made the point that America was different to Europe in not being prone to class politics and class war, to the disappointment of American communists and Marxists and others hoping for a radical class revolution. Class preferences have been toxic in many countries around the world, certainly countries that fell to communist totalitarianism under the banner of class struggle, but also to India, where caste preferences have been a source of bitter, sometimes violent conflict, with systematic diminution of academic quality as well. There are many things this country can do and should do to make higher education and lower education better and more available to each kid to whom it's suited. We can talk about some of these things in the Q&A. Restoring academic standards and integrity, cutting the insane costs of academic bureaucracy and empire building, doing something about the feudal situation, not futile, well, somewhat futile as well, but feudal situation of underpaid adjuncts, doing more and more of the teaching on campus, while some of us tenured professors are probably overpaid and incentivized away from the classroom. But replicating the racial division and injustice of the past 50 years of race preferences and substituting, or realistically adding, class preferences would be a sad outcome if the Supreme Court finally says no more to racialism in government and in public education. Still, let's hope the Supreme Court takes the first step, long overdue, when it decides the fair admissions case, presumably in the next few days or in the next few weeks. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to go to the questions. I think I'm going to there were a bunch of somewhat irritated comments way back when for Mr. Kallenberg. I think I'm going to, and people respond to this, but I think I'll just compress this by saying that if persuading a conservative audience of your beliefs and calling those their beliefs far right is not recommended by Dale Carnegie as a way to win friends and influence people. So a rhetorical note. I'm going to go to a specific question by Richard Golden. Since the beginning of the SFFA litigation, we've often heard calls to abolish athletic preferences, but won't such an abolition have a negative impact on Black athletes who are heavily represented on football, basketball, and track teams at Ivy League and other selective institutions? Or is the call only to abolish preferences for sailing, fencing, and equestrian? How do you pick and choose which sports no longer get preferences? And this is a specific question, but I actually think it's important to work out a number of the specific details. To any and all, in any order wanted.
I'll jump in. First, my apologies to those who are, wait, what is the best way to apologize? You don't say if you are offended. I do want to reach this audience, and if the language is off-putting, I apologize for that. What I will say is that the position that neither race nor class should count in admissions is objectively not a widely shared view. And just as I've told my liberal colleagues for decades, doesn't it bother you that, you have 74% of Americans saying we shouldn't use race and you just keep advocating? Doesn't that give you pause? I would ask, in good faith, just to grapple with that question. The fact that 2/3 of Americans do want racial diversity on campus, and that roughly 2 to 1 people do support giving a preference in admissions to economically disadvantaged people, I hope will make you think about it with an open mind. I guess that's what I'll ask. On the athletic question, so just to be clear, in the litigation, we didn't do anything with athletic preferences. We just said they're going to stay. My personal opinion is that there is a principled rationale for athletic preferences that are good for the institution because they are widely viewed and are money makers for the institution, and that would tend to be sports like football and basketball. I'm also deeply suspicious that many of these elite institutions use these boutique sports as a way of circumventing their ostensibly need-blind policies. So institutions will take great pride in the fact that they'll say, we don't count whether you can afford to go here in the admissions. We're not going to hold that against you. And a way to easily circumvent that is to give large preferences to sports where you know going in that the vast majority of students are going to be from wealthier backgrounds, just because the sports aren't offered at your typical public high school. So I'm suspicious of the motives behind some of those sports that tend to cater to the wealthy. So those would be a couple of ways of distinguishing. I would not do it directly. I wouldn't look at the racial makeup of various sports and cut it that way. That wouldn't be my position.
Can I jump in and respond in substantial part agreeing with Mr. Kallenberg, but also to some extent not. I think he's right that if there were an informal and modest leg up, either on the basis of race or on the basis of class, most people in the country wouldn't be troubled by that. And I think most people on the center right and on the not so center right might not be troubled by it either. The trouble is that, as Lenin once said, he who says A must say B. That isn't always necessarily true, but in a legalistic country like this one, it often is true. And it has proved true about this. And the actual preferences that have developed and grown and metastasized and are continuing to grow over the past 50 years have not been a modest leg up, and they have not been an informal preference. They've become institutionalized and enormous and increasingly all pervasive and all dominating on a lot of campuses. The other side of this, excuse me, sorry about that. It's not infectious over Zoom. The other side of that is the concern that Mr. Kallenberg expressed, that without these preferences, you would not have any possibility of the kinds of diversity, real diversity, including racial diversity and class diversity. And there's evidence against that. In California in 1996, California adopted Proposition 209, which purports to prohibit, nominally prohibits, race preferences, racial and ethnic preferences by the government, including the public universities. The fear was expressed at the time that would mean that the University of California, on its many campuses, and the state universities, which are the next level down, would lose most or all of the students of various minorities, especially Black students. It didn't prove true. There was a dip in Black students, though not a complete abolition of them, at Berkeley, but if anything, an increase on some of the other UC campuses, because you didn't have that cascade of artificial pushing people into schools that they weren't actually qualified for. And so the result was that you didn't have a lack of racial diversity. You do tend to have a lack, certainly at elite at schools like Harvard, and of its would-be peers, a lack of class diversity. But there are various policies of these institutions that create that, or that at least contribute to that. One is that in order to jockey for position in US News rankings and other rankings, there's a strong tendency, increasingly in recent years, to give scholarship aid, which used to be directed at people who need it, not to people who need it, but rather to people with the highest scores, often kids who come from the most privileged backgrounds, and yet they're being bought into schools through these scholarships, and it's a way of boosting up, of goosing up their US News rankings. If you change that, that would itself be a substantial way of helping out people in need, with a program that's designed to help people, or used to be designed to help people in need, without discriminating academically. So it seems to me that whether they're sport preferences or not, those aren't racial preferences. Often they're very bad policies, and I tend to agree with Mr. Kallenberg that a lot of them could be cut back, or a lot of them could be done away with. The University of Chicago famously never, I think, had them, and didn't suffer, certainly academically, from not having them. But There are non-academically, there are ways of having a more diverse class by race and by class as well, without discriminating academically. It seems to me, and I think to many of us, that those ought to be the first resort rather than the last resort, instead of academic preferences, which are limitless, as has been proved in the racial area and would be true in the class area as well.
There seems to me to be some degree of I'm a little bit confused, Professor Schwarzschild. Sometimes you speak and you seem to have a principled objection to taking race into account for purposes of, selecting people for coveted spaces and selective institutions. Your last comments, however, went afield from that. Your last comment suggested that what's wrong with the current regime is that it goes too far. You seem to suggest that modest affirmative action would be okay. It's just that what we have now is, exaggerated affirmative action. Clarify things for me, please.
A perfectly legitimate question. I think you've got me rightly. I'm not sure I am a terribly principled guy about this. And I do think that a modest and informal concern for making sure that you're reaching out, you're welcoming people of different racial backgrounds, of different class backgrounds, also of different regional and ideological and religious backgrounds. All of that in principle is nothing wrong with that. The trouble is that has become institutionalized in the last half century. And it's become institutionalized, I think, in really poisonous ways. There's a kind of Aristotelian idea that if you've gone too far in one direction, you've got to correct it, and sometimes you've got to go a little too far in the other direction in order to come out in the middle way. And perhaps regrettably, I think that's where we are in this country.
Next time we will invite someone for the panel who will say fiat justitia ruat caelum. However, I am actually going to go back to the Brian Fitzpatrick thing. I want to follow up on this. A professor at Vanderbilt of law, I should say, not just a Wall Street Journal op editor. He's been writing this article for at least since 2007. I just want to read a paragraph. Historically, anti-discrimination laws have been interpreted to prohibit both explicit racial classification and racial gerrymandering, facially race-neutral classifications that have the same purpose and effect as explicit racial classifications. This is the case because if these laws prohibited only explicit discrimination, then they would be so easy to evade that they would be rendered toothless. Thus, for example, the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution has long been interpreted to require strict scrutiny of both explicit racial classifications and racial gerrymandering. And I think what I want to ask is not so much whether this should be the case, but to what extent is this, in point of fact, the controlling precedent, and how will that, what range of Supreme Court judicial opinions are possible given this particular legal precedent in history?
Sure. The fact of the matter is, he has a good point. If we think about anti-Black policy that was covered over, let's take, for instance, the case of felon disfranchisement. So the 15th Amendment is passed. The states can no longer exclude people from the ballot for explicitly racial reasons. So the state of Mississippi says, okay, fine, we're not going to exclude, we're not going to say that Black people can't vote. We're simply going to choose certain crimes that we think Black people are more likely to commit. and we are going to disfranchise people who commit those crimes. Our purpose is to get rid of black voters, though we're not going to say that. Well, the Supreme Court of the United States belatedly came around to saying, well, you can't do that. You can't practice racial discrimination through the use of pretext. The grandfather clause. So we're going to treat everybody the same, except we're going to say that if your grandfather could vote, we're going to exempt you from having to pass the same eligibility test as everybody else. Well, that was a way of helping out white voters and discourage and also adversely affecting black voters without saying so. There are many examples of Supreme, there are a whole bunch of other, I just gave you two, but there are a bunch of other cases which one could mention in which the court has said, we're not going to allow indirect racial discrimination. Gamillion versus Lightfoot. In Gamillion versus Lightfoot, you have the city of Tuskegee, and there are 400 black people in the city who were voters. The legislature draws the lines to get rid of all of the black voters. They don't say that they're black. They don't say we're getting rid of these people because they're black, but everybody knows what they're doing. So, the point is there. The question is, will this same reasoning be used in our era? Will there be symmetry in the Supreme Court's efforts with respect to, anti-black indirect racial discrimination versus in our era, Kallenberg indirect policy? And the question is, will there be symmetry? I don't think there will be symmetry, actually. And that's why I think that, the sort of the Kallenberg, and by the way, Richard, I hope you understand, I'm sure you do. I'm not sneering at you at all. There's no sneer here at all. I think that you are, that you are trying to accomplish something quite good. And by the way, and while I'm at it, I was quite heartened by Professor Schwarzschild's response to me when he said, no, I don't have a big beef with affirmative action kept within sensible bounds. What I don't like is affirmative action that goes too darn far. Well, my view would be that's right. Every policy, you can have a smart policy or you can have a dumb policy. I'm in favor of what I would view as, sensible affirmative action. Can it go too far? Yes, it can go too far. Can it be, sort of institutionalized in a way and given theories in a way that are quite unattractive? Yes. And I think that, the current situation, part of the current situation is the harvest of that. But, the effort to try to come to grips with the horrible racist American past and its legacy, the effort to do that, and to also attend to other things. I mean, yes, that's an important legacy, but we have a complicated society. We can't just focus on redressing past racial discrimination, and that's all we do. We have an ongoing society. There are lots of things that we have to do at the same time. And it seems to me that it's a good thing for people to think about ways of pursuing the various complicated tasks of society, doing so in tandem, doing so by making sure that we don't go too far this way or that. So there's certain ways in which actually I derive some degree of comfort out of the conversation that we are having.
Can I jump in? First of all, as usual, I agree with so much of what Randy Kennedy is saying here. And I agree that, of course, there is a certain logic to the Fitzpatrick argument that you can't simply discriminate by proxy when you're discriminating against Black people. My point is that I think that he makes a leap in saying, okay, as of now, Supreme Court hasn't ruled, racial diversity is a compelling interest. Flip the switch after the decision, and suddenly it's an impermissible interest. There is a middle ground, which is that racial diversity can be a permissible purpose, but not compelling. And by not compelling, I mean it no longer justifies the use of explicit racial preferences, but is nevertheless permissible. And I expect that's where the Supreme Court will ultimately land. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if when the decision comes down, we see some language to reassure the American public, which says, you can no longer use race, but here's what you can do, because we recognize this is a hard issue. And we do have competing interests here. And a middle ground is to say permissible interest, but not compelling. I think that's where they'll end up.
The trouble is that the idea of a compelling state interest, the compelling state interest standard that's developed in constitutional law essentially since the 1930s, and certainly since the 1950s where race is concerned, 40s and 50s. The idea is that race discrimination in particular is really something that the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, the post-Civil War Constitution prohibits, and prohibits in the absence of a compelling state interest, what I sometimes in class call a compelling state interest, virtually that the country won't survive, or that the future of the country is really imperiled. And that there's a compelling state interest, therefore, to discriminate on the basis of race. And in the absence of that you can't and that you mustn't. There isn't much middle ground there. The compelling state interest idea is the idea that in the absence of some very, very overwhelming, powerful need and reason, that race discrimination is something that that public institutions, that government institutions mustn't be doing under the Constitution. That's pretty binary. That says most of the time don't do this. Almost all the time don't do this. It seemed that the Bakke and Grutter idea that there's a compelling state interest in racial proportional representation, which is sort of what it amounted to, is extraordinarily perverse. The idea that a discriminatory program that most people of all races and of all ethnicities in the country are opposed to and think is unjustifiable, that kind of racial favoritism is nonetheless a compelling state interest, is a weird and seems to me perverse idea. So the idea, as always with these things, try to flip it. Suppose someone were to say in the Mississippi of the any time from 1900 to 1965, and they did say things like this, that our way of life, our society depends on segregation and on racial discrimination, and we have a compelling interest in this. And imagine that the Supreme Court were to say, well, no, you don't have a compelling interest in it. You still have a legitimate interest in it. So you can't do some things, but you can do other things in order to vindicate that interest that you have, even if it isn't a compelling interest. Nobody would buy that. What the court meant when it said no race discrimination except when there's a compelling state interest is no race discrimination except in a very, very few cases where there really is a compelling state interest. And there isn't much middle ground there.
Thank you so much. I am going to go to a question of my own, inspired somewhat by some previous webinars. Let us say that there are 3 classes within our university system. Community colleges, where we will say they will take more or less everyone, and affirmative action simply isn't relevant one way or the other. Then the broad, say the UC system, where it's a decision about whether you go into UCLA or UC Irvine, and then elite colleges such as Harvard. And I'm going to say there are 2 different purposes for affirmative action. One, to make sure that the middle class is roughly diverse, however defined, and a second one, that the elite, the Harvard graduates, are diverse. Is the goal to have a racially diverse, what have you, workforce, and an elite, which is diverse, distinguishable in law? And how should I put it? Can it be distinguished in law between those 2 goals, and should it be distinguished in law?
Let me just say, I'm not going to be satisfactorily responsive to your question. I think it's an interesting question, a good question. I'll have to think about it. But your question does trigger something that's been bothering me lately in these discussions, and that is that I think oftentimes that people forget an underlying point that's in your question. People, we talk about affirmative action as if it was an issue for most institutions of higher education in the United States. It's not. Affirmative action is really a burning issue at a relatively few places. Now, those places are the elite schools, and I think that one of the things that these debates show is how deeply invested we are, for practical reasons, but also maybe for symbolic reasons, maybe for psychological reasons. We're so deeply invested in what happens at the most elite levels. We tend to be a lot less invested in institutions that actually serve a lot more people. I mean, I think that one might criticize, people like me. I've spent, many hours in debates and writing, defending affirmative action. And, what it really comes down to is, well, will a kid go to the University of Michigan Law School, or will the kid go to, well, this is before the University of Michigan Law School, this is before the Michigan passed its anti-affirmative action referendum, but so will the kid go to the, elite school, the most elite school in the state, the University of Michigan Law School, or, Berkeley, or will the kid go to some other law school? Now, you might very well say, if you are in a position to be a plausible candidate at an elite law school, you're going to do okay. That means that you've graduated from college. That means you've done pretty well at college to be a plausible candidate. Frankly, we don't need to worry about you so much. You're going to do okay. Why is it, I think someone could really ask, why is it that we're not spending more time on, what about the plight of the kids who don't make it through high school? What about the plight of the kids who make it through high school and are functionally illiterate? That's not grabbing my emotions in a big way. When was the last time I was at some symposium about those kids? And, I think that people from all ideological vantages actually should wrestle with that a lot more.
Here, I think that's just right. One thing about that, though, the upper middle class in this country is increasingly chosen from the graduates of elite or near elite colleges and universities. That didn't used to be true. As recently as the mid-20th century, there were surveys of CEOs of big corporations. Most of them hadn't been to Ivy League or elite universities. A lot of them had come up through the ranks of their bureaucratic corporation. It's not true anymore. And what used to distinguish the US, for instance, from Britain, where the public school, Eton and Harrow and Oxford and Cambridge graduates really dominated everything that dominated the country. That didn't used to be true here, and increasingly it is. And to the extent that the governing class, the elite, the upper middle class is selected through admission to elite or near elite colleges and universities, it matters more and more who's being admitted to those and on what basis. I think at one point in one of the cases, I think not the most recent one, but in one of the affirmative action cases that came up to the Supreme Court, Justice Thomas, I think, put it in oral argument to one of the parties. Look, I think it was in Grutter, and it involved the University of Michigan. And they said, look, what if you're so worried about this, why don't you just have open admissions, you guys? And then there won't be any question of what the criteria for admission are and whether those criteria are being racialized. And you could it was almost palpable the kind of horror on the part of the University of Michigan and its lawyers. No, we're trying to be we want to be in on this elite thing. And to the extent that the pathways to a successful life in this country are being ever more narrowed to admission to these universities, that's worrisome. What it ensures is the kind of battles that we're seeing over these issues.
Yeah, great.
And I'll just quickly agree with my colleagues here. I've spent a lot of time on the financing of community colleges, precisely for the reason that you all mentioned. That's where the numbers are. You care about social mobility in this country. Community colleges are the quintessential institution for the aspiring middle class. You have to care about that. And the flip side is I'll also agree that it matters who goes to selected colleges. So there's one study that found 50% of government leaders and 49% of corporate leaders come from 12 institutions in this country. So both things matter. Maybe we give disproportionate attention to the elites, but I want us to continue to focus on both.
The one influences the other, of course. So that to the extent that the selective and elite schools are pushing an ideology to justify its preferences, that ideology bleeds out into the more general society. And there's strong evidence that what's going on in a lot of public schools across the country is indoctrination in these ideologies, or an attempted indoctrination in these ideologies at the expense of ordinary teaching, or what used to be ordinary teaching, so that the academic results coming out of public schools in California and in other states are horrifying. The extent to which kids of all races, but especially of unprivileged backgrounds, who are coming out of very expensive public schools, very expensive, lavishly funded public schools, unable to read, unable to write, unable to do basic maths is horrifying. And the contrast between that and the success of school systems in Japan and other places around the world is ought to be very worrisome for this country. And so that the relationship between what's going on elite campuses and the failures of institutions that are meant to serve very non-elite constituencies, there's a relationship there, and a damaging one.
Thank you. I want to have a question building on a comment from George Lee, which was, the Supreme Court in Bakke and then Grutter supported diversity that would promote robust exchange of ideas. And the later comment, this has not resulted. To what extent legally is, in point of fact, the existence of a university campus with a robust exchange of ideas a predicate for these various affirmative action diversity policies? And to what extent could fact-finding about the existence of a robust exchange of ideas be legally relevant for future Supreme Court cases concerning university affirmative action and diversity policies?
Well, one of the interesting things that has happened in the whole affirmative action debate, one of the most interesting things that has happened, is the judiciary's embrace of diversity as the principal predicate for taking race into account in making selection decisions. Other justifications were discussed and the Supreme Court knocked them down. So the idea of integration, the idea of reparative justice, of some of these, various ideas that people floated for justifying affirmative action were knocked down. The one that was embraced by the Supreme Court was diversity. And once the Supreme Court embraced diversity as the rationale, that kicked off, since when the Supreme Court talked diversity talk, everybody followed. And to get back to your question, the question, that has become very important in the sense that there are now hundreds of studies where people have said, well, is it true that where you have a more racially diverse student body, you have, richer discussion? I mean, is it true as a pedagogical theory? Now, some people say yes, some people say no. With issues like this that are so wide open, that are so politicized, one can understand why there would be, various camps within social science about this. But, has there been fact finding about this? Yeah, there's been fact finding. There's been a lot of, study of this. I think the study of this has its own ideological overlay, and it may very well be that in a situation like this, that was to be expected, and maybe maybe it was unavoidable. But yeah, there has been, fact finding on this, and might the fact finding play a role in litigation? It's possible. Depending on what the Supreme Court says, it may be a moot question if the Supreme Court rules the way in which I think many people think that the Supreme Court will rule.
Let's be a little clearer. I mean, Randall Kennedy alludes to several things here, but just to be clear, it's something even more bizarre than the Supreme Court saying that it's diversity, rather than other more plausible justifications for affirmative action. That's diversity that's the compelling state interest. It was originally not the Supreme Court, it was one isolated Supreme Court justice. The Bakke decision had a 4-4 split between the center left on the court, who said that affirmative action was constitutional or legal, the center right, who said that it wasn't, and Justice Powell, all on his own, in a kind of dictum, saying, well, diversity, not the policy in the case that was before the court, but diversity in some other case might be a compelling state interest, and that sort of obiter rumination by one justice should create what Randall Kennedy rightly calls a change in the ethos of the country, and almost a change in the culture of at least broad parts of the country, is sort of an extraordinary testimony to the power or the exaggerated deference to that the Supreme Court sometimes gets in this country. So that one person's dictum, which then was taken over by a majority of the court, a bare majority of the court, in the Grutter decision decades later, has it produced more actual diversity in the universities and increasingly in these other institutions to which these ideas are spreading? And the answer is, I think, Randall Kennedy alludes to it, but the numbers and what has been discovered is overwhelming. That in liberal arts colleges and universities, you now have 95%, 98%, 99%, 100% people of the center left or the far left. It looks like a Soviet election from the days of the Soviet Union. Does that represent a diversity of debate on the campuses? To ask the question is to answer it. Of course it doesn't. And this is a new phenomenon. You didn't have in the aggressive affirmative action era. You had a much greater diversity, real diversity of ideas and of politics and of outlooks and of views than you have on most or virtually all selective colleges and many non-selective colleges and campuses today. In terms of fact-finding in the narrower sense, are the facts available easily about what is actually being done on the affirmative action policies? And the answer is that a lot of the schools, Georgetown is a famous one, it's happened at Berkeley, it's happened in a lot of other places, that people try to find out exactly how big, how enormous is the preference that you're giving to particular identity groups. And the schools desperately don't want to answer those questions and do everything they can to stonewall it. So that even in that narrow sense, you have a wall against fact-finding. And in terms of a broadly diverse debate, you have increasingly a one-party, almost East German scene in higher education in this country, which is very hard to think is a healthy development.
And Mr. Kallenberg?
I think that there's so much that's been said that I agree with, parts that I disagree with. So I think I think there is good evidence that when people bring different life experiences to discussions, that enhances the robustness of the conversation. That could be race, that could be class, which is completely lacking at elite universities. It could be intellectual diversity, again, completely lacking at elite universities. So I think if diversity is going to be embraced as a serious concept, it needs to be embraced across the board rather than selectively focusing only on race. I used to joke that with my conservative friends that those who were at Harvard were getting the best education possible because they actually had to defend their ideas all day long, whereas those of us on the left just went along and everyone agreed, and it was just that we're not being sharpened the way that conservatives are.
Can I jump in here for a minute, because I see in the chat someone has mentioned my home institution, Harvard Law School. I do want to speak up for my institution, Harvard Law School. Harvard Law School was the institutional home of Archibald Cox. It was Archibald Cox's brief that brought the diversity idea to Lewis Powell's attention. And Lewis Powell, was that, decisive vote that Professor Schwarzschild just mentioned. That's one thing. I do want to say that I think that the ideological or the issue of freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom to listen, freedom to teach is a huge problem. I think that people from all ideological vantages should be concerned about that. What's going on with the state legislatures on the one hand, and what's going on with the informal pall of orthodoxy on the other. I think it's a very broad problem, and it concerns me quite deeply. I will say, for my home institution, Harvard Law School, because it's dinged so often, I feel compelled to speak up for it. Harvard Law School, ideologically, if you take a look at its faculty, a fairly wide, fairly broad ideological spectrum. The dean of Harvard Law School, who is a wonderful dean, clerk for Judge Bork, Justice Scalia, is, conservative in many respects. I have several, conservative colleagues. I have several colleagues who are, way to the left, as I would see it, or at least way to the left in the American political spectrum. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about our, pigeonholing of institutions. I feel very fortunate to be part of an institution that I think is actually quite broad-minded and does facilitate research, thinking, teaching in a quite open and expansive way.
I think it's true that Harvard, at least, Yale is a different story. That Harvard, at least, has more genuine academic freedom than a lot of places have. One could wryly also, though, say that I think Randall Kennedy is probably somewhat on the right of the Harvard Law faculty, and that tells you something as well.
On that note, I think I'm going to say it's time for me to ask you all for your concluding statements before there's sort of a bow out by me to everyone. May I ask if people would be willing, same order, I suppose, alphabetical, a concluding statement from each of you, 1 minute each, perhaps? Mr. Kallenberg first.
Sure, I think we're at an important crossroads as the Supreme Court is about to rule on this decision. I think there have been mistakes on the left for a number of years in underappreciating the degree to which racial preferences are deeply unpopular and come with a host of costs that are not often acknowledged. But there is something important that racial preferences have brought us, which is an effort, an imperfect one, to try to address, in some measure, a really terrible history of racial discrimination. And I think moving forward, I hope that that conservatives will recognize that there is something good that has been accomplished. The means may have gone too far, but that there ought to be an effort, a good faith effort, to try to recognize history in new ways that will be less divisive.
Thank you. Just quickly, first of all, I really appreciate the invitation that was sent my way. I haven't participated before with the NAS. I have very much enjoyed this discussion. And, look forward to perhaps more discussions in the future in other, other formats, other forums. Secondly, I have very much enjoyed my colloquy with my colleagues. We differ in certain ways that everybody who's been listening could, pick up on and hear. I also think, however, that there's a certain sort of common feeling, and I was listening carefully. I think I'll come away from this having learned a few things and having maybe modifying my own views in relation to the colloquy that we've had. So my final comment really is a big, broad thank you.
And thank you. Professor Schwarzschild.
And it has been a great discussion, I think, and the three of us at least have a lot in common in terms of our views. That doesn't necessarily reflect the situation in the country, which is worrisomely polarized and worrisomely embittered. And there's some reason to think that the preference regime and more broadly, the degree of kind of top-down social engineering or efforts at top-down social engineering have advanced that bitterness and that divisiveness and that anger in society. I think it's something to be aware of, and in particular, a kind of social engineering in terms of higher education has a nasty history in this country, going back to the early 20th century, actually really the first half of the 20th century, where elite schools or near elite schools didn't want the children, certainly of Eastern European Jewish immigrants to the United States, and developed all kinds of secret or semi-secret admissions policies in order to ensure that they didn't get too many or any of them. You see that replicated today in the fate of Asian American applicants, not only to colleges and universities, but to academic high schools as well, where children with no privilege whatsoever, and their parents with no influence and no money, and first generation poor immigrant families are being shut out of high schools. The Thomas Jefferson High School in Virginia, which Kallenberg alluded to as an example of it, and on college campuses as well. That kind of top-down social engineering is most worrisome. What I think probably the three of us might agree that we hope comes out of whatever the Supreme Court does is that at least in the medium run, the degree of divisiveness in the society and of a kind of polarized sense that we're not common citizens, but, or in Lincoln's words, not friends, but enemies, that sense will be diminished. I think, I do think that the way we've been able to tease out our thoughts together today should be a good model of that. I hope it can spread to the country as well. That's sort of the most optimistic view of what might come out of whatever the Supreme Court does this week or in the next week or so.
So thank you very much to all of you. So I have a bunch of thanks first. Thank you. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, our audience. The audience, we do it for you. We can't do it without you. Your questions fuel the discussion. But thank you to everyone. I just wanted advertisements. One, if you enjoyed this, consider joining the National Association of Scholars. We do many things, but not least having webinars like this and other webinar series, such as on American Science and upcoming Tuesdays, We've got stuff on George Washington Carver in one upcoming in American Innovations webinar, something on the Green Revolution for another, more to come. I think this may actually be the last of this particular series on after affirmative action, because we did sort of time it so that it would conclude with the Supreme Court decision. Once the Supreme Court decision comes out, it is of course entirely possible that we will have a new webinar series taking account of what are the implications now that it's actually out. So although I think we don't have anything more formally scheduled for this, I would be startled if we will not have some, more webinars on this subject, fast and furious in the course of the next year. I think everybody's going to be doing that, come to think of it. Anyway, so that is what's upcoming. I just want to say once more, if you have leftover questions, please direct them to me, randall@nas.org. Delighted to forward them to the participants, and so they can have the option to answer. And then again, this will be available on our National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours in perpetuity, along with all the other webinars in this series and every other webinar we have ever done or ever will do. So again, thank you all so much.
Thank you, David Randall. And